Hi everyone, my name is Ho Lee Hun. I am from University Sultan Zainal Abidin, Malaysia. Today's topic, I'm going to talk about sourdough. Sourdough, a type of pre-ferment which involves starting a culture of microorganisms which are yeast and bacteria that present naturally from environment and in the flour, and using them to ferment the final dough. The growing of microorganisms is under controlled conditions. These microorganisms need three elements to grow. They are food, water, and oxygen. Food is provided in the form of simple sugars that naturally contain in flour or formed from enzymatic activity. For water, water is added into flour for hydration purpose. Oxygen is supplied by air that naturally incorporated during mixing process. There are several steps involved in sourdough preparation. They are creating a culture, elaborating the culture, preparing the culture for use. In this stage, the culture is called a starter. Next, feeding. Feeding the starter. After the final feeding, which is commonly known as the second feeding, before incorporation into the final dough, the culture is called leaven. Next, perpetuating the culture. It can be done by saving a piece of dough either from the leaven or from the final dough. At this stage, the culture is again called a starter. Lastly, the leaven is incorporated into a final dough for sourdough bread making. First step, creating culture. To create culture, we need flour, water, and a jar. Glass jar is more preferable than the metal jar because the metal jar is always cause rusting due to the acid. To increase the chances for starting culture to survive, it is advisable to use organic flour because of it lacks chemicals like herbicide and pesticides. Rye flour also can be used because it contains more wild yeast and bacteria than wheat flour, and it is also rich in minerals. Besides, water is used for hydration purpose. Yeast is classified as wild because it is present in natural environment. The common wild yeasts are identified as Saccharomyces acigus, Candida tropicalis, and Hansenula anomala. This yeast has characteristics more resistant to acid as compared to commercial yeast, which make it better adapted to the sourdough process. In the whole process of sourdough preparation, yeast utilize glucose and fructose and then produce alcohol and carbon dioxide through fermentation process. For bacteria, there are two types of bacteria involved. They are homofermentative lactic bacteria, bacteria that produce only lactic acid, and heterofermentative lactic bacteria, bacteria produce both lactic acid and acetic acid. Lactic acid is directly contribute to the flavor of the end product, whereas acetic acid is important to reinforce or to enhance the flavor of the end product, which produce much sharper flavor. Elaborating the culture. At this stage, many different types of microorganisms are present in the culture. At the beginning of the process, the microorganism reproduction is under aerobic condition because there is still sufficient oxygen in the dough with presence of small population or limited microorganisms. Then, more and more flora or microorganisms are grown after several hours of culturing. An increase in the population of microorganisms has switched them to an aerobic. During evaporation, the quantity and quality of yeast and bacteria is balanced because they can cohabitation, means they are not compete among them for food. They are not utilize same carbohydrate, in which bacteria utilize maltose, a disaccharide, whereas the yeast use simple sugar, monosaccharide. A starter. When you see the culture rise to 4 times its initial volume in 6 to 8 hours of fermentation at room temperature, the culture is now can be called as starter. Feeding. Feeding is to keep the flora alive and active by renewing their vital conditions. Renew its food by adding flour, water, and air. Before adding, please remember to discard a little bit of all culture. The time between 2 feedings depends on temperature, activity, hydration, and ingredients used. Now, how to know when is the feeding time for the culture? Now you can see if there is a concave or collapse in the center of surface, this indicates the culture need to be fed. The feeding involves 2 times per day. Commonly, at the second feeding or last feeding, the starter can be called as leaven. Leaven is the natural pre-ferment, can be used to ferment the final dough. Now, this is how the jar looks like if feeding without discarding. Perpetuating the culture. There are 2 possible methods for obtaining the starter used to perpetuate the culture. In the first method, the starter is removed from the leaven just before the leaven is incorporated into the final dough, whereas in the second method, a piece of final dough can be removed just before salt is incorporated becomes the first feeding. Now, you can either use leaven or a piece of final dough that's saved from previous final dough for making a good and tasty bread. Several factors can change the microbiological activity of the culture during the process and affect the final characteristic of the end product. First factor, hydration. A stiff culture will have the tendency to develop more acetic acid, whereas liquid leaven will increase the production of lactic acid. Second, temperature. High temperatures. Temperature between 29 to 32 degrees C is considered as high temperature. It favors bacterial activity and the production of lactic acid. But fermentation is more difficult to control due to a higher yeast activity, whereas low temperatures suppress fermentation activity. Temperature around 25 degrees C is optimum for fermentation activity. Third factor, flour. Enzyme activity and bran content determine the amount of simple sugar and minerals available for the microorganism. Flour with a higher ash and amylase provides better activity and higher acid production. Lastly, salt. Amounts higher than 0.1% can inhibit the activity of some microorganisms. Advantages of making sourdough bread are this process is less costly. Low pH of the sourdough results in more safe product produced. This process is also improve the bread quality as well as improve the bioavailability of iron. And lastly, a different variety of flavor and taste of the bread can be produced. That's all for sharing today. Thank you for your listening.